Hey guys, welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about the material creation system inside of Blender. This is a procedural material that I've built with some displacement, some emission, and a lot of different inputs. By the end of this tutorial, you guys will have built this material. It's just to explain how um, the Principled BSDF shader works and how we can use that to create procedural materials and how we can use that to adapt existing image textures. So to start off with, I'm going to create a new Blender scene. And we're going to work with this default cube here. So the first thing we want is the sphere to work from. And I'm going to subdivide this cube in order to create my sphere. And to add the subdivision, I'm going to go to the modifier properties on the side here, click add modifier and choose subdivision surface. And that will start to turn my sphere, my cube into a sphere if I start to add in levels. So I have viewport levels and I have render levels. So if you've not seen this modifier before, there's a render setting and a viewport setting. The viewport setting is set to 2. It starts to become spherical. If I set this to simple, my cube remains cube-like. It doesn't become a sphere, but it will still be subdivided. If I look at this in the wireframe view up here by clicking on the wireframe viewport shading, I still see the wireframe of just the cube, and that's because of this optimal display option here. So if I uncheck optimal display and I turn off this X-ray view here, toggle X-ray, I will see just how this cube is being divided into two times. Okay, so it's given us 4 divisions in total. If I put it back to Catmull Clark, you see this. You see it starts to become a sphere, and that's because with this subdivision setting, it's going to start to average out all of the straight edges and start to turn them into, much smoother transitions. We want more subdivision than this because we're going to use displacement eventually, so I'm just going to increase this amount a couple more times. But if I look at this in the shaded view again, so if I go into the viewport shading here, you can still see the faces of this subdivision. So I can still see all of these squares, and this is quite easy to get rid of. You just right click the object and click the shade smooth option, and that will now make this look a lot smoother than it did before without changing the subdivision levels. And because my render amount is now lower than my viewport amount, I'm going to want to increase this maybe to 5 for my render so that I have even more subdivision for the render, so there's more detail there. But I'll come back to that later. The reason that I set this up as a cube that's subdivided and not a sphere, because I could quite simply press Shift and A, search for mesh, and add a UV sphere, for example. And if I just move this to the side, I can explain why. So whilst the sphere has good quad-based topology as well as the cubed one, the main difference is this pinching that happens in the top. So if we look at this from the top, with the spherical one, our texture is going to be pinched into this kind of little point here because of how these faces are projected. Whereas with the subdivided cube, our topology is kind of flat and consistent across anything. There's no pinching. The same from the side and the bottom. That's why I'm going to use the cube in this instance and not you just click and add a sphere. So just to explain that if you are wondering. Next, I'm going to just check that we have the Node Wrangler add-on activated. So go to Edit, Preferences, go to Add-ons, search for Node, N-O-D-E, and check that Node Wrangler is activated because this will speed up our workflow considerably. So make sure you've got this box checked, and then this will be all the shortcuts will be activated for us to work with. So next, we can set up the viewport that we want to work with. So I want to have a textured view in the side and then have a viewport here, a 3D viewport. So I'm going to right click here. I'm going to click vertical split, and I'm just going to split this view in half. Zoom in on this side, and on here I'm going to turn this workspace into a shaded shader editor. So to change the workspace, go up here, choose editor type, and go down to shader editor. And now if I roll my mouse to zoom out a bit, I should be able to find the shader for this material. Okay, so here is my principled shader. If your cube doesn't have a material applied already and your viewport looks like this, there's no material here, just select your object, go to the right side of the screen, check your material properties, and be sure to click New. This will add a new material, and then this will allow you to create the shader that we're going to work with today. This is the material properties. This is where we'll be a lot. You do have up here the different workspaces. So there's a shading workspace accessible here already. But I prefer setting things up side by side rather than on top of each other. And it's good to know how to adapt your own workspace. So let's go into our render view here. So there's these different viewport options, and I'm going to choose the right side one, which is display render preview. And this is our current render preview. If we look at on the right side here, there's render properties that looks like the back of a camera. And if we click here, we can see that we're in render engine EEVE, which is fine to start off with. We can go into cycles later on when we're starting to add detail, but I'll start this explanation using the EEVE engine, which is quicker to work with. The next thing I'm going to do is add an HDRI light to this scene, because right now everything is quite flat and grey, and I want some more interesting lighting to work with. So whilst I'm in the shaded view on the right side, so under the workspaces here, make sure in the shader workspace, and I have this option here for object. And now I'm clicked on this object and I'm affecting the material based on this object. If I drop this menu down and choose world, I can now affect the world settings, so everything that's happening around this object. And that is where this background color comes into play here. So if I click here and I change this color up to white, my background becomes white. If I change it to blue, it becomes blue. That's however. We're going to add an HDRI image texture to this, an environment texture. And to do that with Node Wrangler activated, you can choose the background node, choose here and press Control and T on the keyboard, and Blender will create this three strings of nodes for you. And one of them is texture coordinates, one of them is mapping, and one of them is environment texture. And it's the environment texture we want to take a look at to add a world, an environment here. So let's click Open. I'm going to go to my HDRI folder and take a look at what I've got. I think maybe this one, this 2K right here, I'm going to open. And now I have a world light in this viewport over here in the render view. That also means I can delete there's one light already in the scene by default here if you look in the outline on the top right side. So if you just choose this light and press X to delete it, we're now only using this world light. And if you want to rotate this world around a bit to change the direction the light's coming from, you can use this mapping node right here and change the Z rotation. So if you change this, your world will kind of start to spin around, and we're going to change the direction the light's going to come from. So maybe I want the light to kind of come from the side here. So I'm just going to spin this around a little bit. So if we go back to work in our material workspace now, so I'm going to choose this object. I'm going to change from world here in the top of the screen, from world back to object. And I can look at the Principled BSDF. And this has a lot of settings built into it already, and then we're going to layer lots of things on top of this. So first I'll show base color. This is literally the color of our material. So if we wanted to have this kind of orange color, for example, we can. The metallic shows us how metallic this material is. So if I turn the metallic value all the way up, this will start to look more like a metal. If I turn it all the way down, it will look non-metallic. If I use the roughness, I can turn this down to be completely shiny, and now we have like a reflective metallic sphere. And if I turn this all the way up, I'll have a completely matte sphere. So again, you can combine the metallic and the roughness to get different effects. Now I can leave this looking a bit reflective, let's say. We have alpha and transmission, which I'm going to show you in cycles because right now they're not going to affect in EEVE. I think the same for transmission, we're not getting any result. These will work better in cycles, and with a little work in EEVE, we can also work with the alpha. The point being that all of these have like a switch from 0 to 1 to turn them on and off. But we can also give these an image input or a color input to turn them on and off as well. So if I press Shift and A on the keyboard and I search for an RGB and just drop an RGB node in here, if I make this RGB node completely black and I plug this into the roughness, for example, my roughness is turned off completely. So this is very, very shiny right now. If I push this from black up to white, the roughness changes again from shiny to rough. So white would be complete roughness 1, and black would be 0 roughness 0. So this works for all of these kind of inputs right here. So if I were to take this and plug it into metallic, I've lost the look of the metallic here, and it's kind of now just become this shiny, almost plastic material, because again, black would be 0 metallic and white would be 1 metallic. So what I could do here is press Shift and A and search for an invert node and just drop the invert on the string connecting the RGB to the metallic. And the effect of that would be to change this value from black and invert it to white. So now we have a metallic switch basically that we've created here. So when we understand that this is all based on black and white inputs, we can really start to design and create with this using different noise textures and different inputs like I showed you in the beginning. So if I just highlight these nodes and delete them, what we can start off with is a noise texture. So I'm going to press Shift and A to search for a noise, N-O-I-S-E, and take the noise texture node here. If you want to see what a node is doing to our material, we want to view the output, I could just take the color output of this and drop it into the surface node right over here. Basically, this is our shader and this is our material output, this node here. So this is what's being applied to the surface. This shader is being applied to the surface here. If I take this color output and I apply it to the surface socket here, I will see what this noise texture is doing. But with Blender, there's a nice shortcut to be able to do this without dragging these connections around. If I press Control and Shift on the keyboard at the same time, so Control Shift, and then I use my left mouse click, and I click the BSDF here, it will now reconnect the BSDF to the surface. If again I do Control and Shift and left click the color output here, it will connect the color. If I click the factor, it will connect the factor. And that's true for any nodes that we're working with. So if you ever want to see what it looks like, just this node by itself, press Control, Shift, and left click on the socket that you want to look at. So for us right now, we're going to look at color. This noise texture is creating this color noise here. It's got color in it. We can change this using all the settings here. I can change the scale of this. I can change the detail on this. I can change the roughness, which is giving it again some detail, distortion. There's a lot to work with. I want this to become black and white information, so I could use this factor. So if I look at the factor with Control Shift and left click, I do have this convert to black and white information as an output. But what would be good is to have control over the intensity of these values. So I've added a bit to the scale, I've changed a bit the detail. I think if I zoom in, you might be able to see more of the detail. Like this is less and then more. We can do that by adding in a ramp. So if I press Shift and A and I search for a color ramp, and I just drop the color ramp here, I take the color output of the noise texture and drop it to the factor input of the color ramp. And then I'm going to again use Control and Shift and then left click on my color ramp output. And I can see the output of this ramp now. So if I look at the ramp and I take these two sliders right here, there's a black one and a white one. If I bring these in, I can intensify the contrast between the black and the whites. So in this way, we get some really dark spots, we get some much lighter areas as well, and then we get some kind of mid-grays. I could even press this plus button to add in another gray slider and push some of these gray values in different directions as well. For now, I'm going to leave this with just the black and the white sliders and just reduce this contrast a little bit. I think like this. So if I now go back to viewing my Principled BSDF and not this color ramp, I go here, so Control Shift and click the BSDF shader. If I take this color now, the output of our color ramp, so now my BSDF is connected to my surface on the material output, my noise texture is connected to a color ramp, and I'm going to now connect the color ramp to the roughness. This is now affecting our roughness channel. So you see how we have now been able to apply a pattern to our material that is using the roughness. And if I change the scale, everything is going to update accordingly. So this is quite a nice way to have full control over how we want to build this material. The next thing that we can do is look at plugging this into the metallic. And we might want to give ourselves some space to work with here. So if I spread these nodes out a bit, our noise texture is going to be our initial input. Then we're going to go to this color ramp to set the contrast in the black and white like we want. And then we can even change this for the roughness, because now a majority of this is rough and less of it is reflective. And maybe we want to do this in a different way. So let's add in another color ramp here that we can use for the roughness and then one for the metallic. So I'll press Shift and A, search for another ramp, and drop this color ramp in between these here. And we can also use this to create an invert switch like we did before. So previously we've added an invert node. And if now I just drag the black one to the right side and the white one to the left side, I can switch this, the way that these black and white values are being projected. So now I've swapped them around. And I could then drag these down to make this look a little bit shinier. I could add in a gray value in the middle and push this down a bit. So now I have this nice shine. And then I'm going to press Shift and A, search for a curves, an RGB curves, and drop that in here as well. So now we can make a metallic input on this as well. So I'm going to take the color output of this, I'm going to drop it to the color input of my RGB curves, and then I'm going to connect this output to the metallic slot right here. And initially there's going to be no change really, because we've already connected this with the color ramp. And I'm just going to click and drag this down. So it's going to kind of take away some of the metallic. But what we can then do is add either an invert, or we could push this up in the other direction. So this will push the values more in the direction of the black, and this will be more in the direction of white. So again, I could view this output if I press Control Shift and I left click the RGB node. So this is my metallic texture right now, and this is the opposite direction. So you see one is much darker than the other, and I think we want it more like this. So again, we can view this output if I press Control Shift and I left click the node. We've reconnected our node. So now our roughness value and our metallic value are being controlled by these two black and white textures. They're all coming from this color ramp that allows us to control the contrast here, so we can always go back to this stage. And we're slowly building up little points of control that we can use to adjust this material. One thing we can do at this stage is if I go to the noise texture input that we've got here, and I press Control and T on the keyboard, I can add some mapping nodes into this and the texture coordinate again. And I can use these locations to move the location of my noise. So if I want to change how this looks, I can do that also at this stage here. You can rotate things. So maybe I want to rotate something, and change how this design is positioned. That's possible at this point here. What we can look at now is this entire material, but in the cycles render. So to make sure that we're working with our GPU, I'm going to go to Edit, Preferences, go to System, and make sure that you've got your NVIDIA or whatever your graphics card is activated, and unselect your CPU so that we only work with our graphics card. On the right side, go to your render options and choose render properties and change your render engine from EEVE to Cycles. And under devices, it will default to CPU, but you want to change this to GPU. And this will now mean that we are rendering our material in the Cycles render engine, and we have a little bit of noise that you see that we didn't have in the EEVE render engine. But what this means we can do now is look at some transparency. So if I take this output here and drop this from the first ramp that we've made and drop this into the alpha of our Principled BSDF, we've now added transparency to this. We can see through the sphere, we can see to the other side of it. If I go back from Cycles into EEVE, you will see the problem with EEVE and transparency, and this is easy to fix. Right now we've got these kind of black artifacts that are stopping us from getting any actual transparency here. And this is just a different setting in EEVE versus Cycles. Cycles is working by default, EEVE is not. To fix that, make sure you've got your object selected, go to the right side, choose the material properties, the red circle at the bottom, scroll all the way down in these settings here, and look under the drop-down menu called Settings, and you will have Blend Mode and Shadow Mode. Turn Blend Mode from Opaque to Alpha Blend, and our transparency should start to become visible. Right, so this is now working inside EEVE. You have another setting for shadows, so you can look at how this affects your render in the end if you turn it to hashed, clipped, opaque, or none. They will have slightly different effects, and this does look a bit different than it does in Cycles, but we still have the option to use this transparency inside of EEVE. I'm still going to work with Cycles, so I'm going to go back up to the top here, choose this render properties icon, the one that looks like a camera, go from EEVE into Cycles, and here we are again. So now we have this kind of transparent material. Again, I could press Shift and A, search for another ramp, drop this ramp onto the connection into the alpha socket here. So now I have noise to ramp, ramp to another ramp, and then the ramp to the alpha. And I could just change some of these values to make it more or less transparent. So maybe I want smaller holes. Maybe I want it to look more like a mesh or something like this. That's also possible. You know, you can sharpen these things up, and again, to view this, press Control, Shift, and left click, and you see what's going on here. The black is being made completely transparent, and the white is completely opaque, and any gray in between will be slightly visible. So I'm going to go back again, Control, Shift, and left click on the BSDF output, and view this material again. We can also look at how this affects the emission. So if I just take this out of the alpha for a second, and I drop this output into the emission, what we're actually seeing now is this material is projecting light. So if I turn up the emission strength, you see the light intensifies, and that's based on where this white value is positioned here. So if I push this down, the areas that are glowing are smaller. If I push this back up, they become larger. And I can change the color of this glow. Again, if I look under this color ramp, I can change this color value here. So if I make it blue, for example, I now have some blue lights shining out of this material. Again, this is not working on a basis of black to white. This is actually an RGB input. So if you see here, emission has a yellow color, which means we can feed in actually any color we want. The same for subsurface color and the same for base color. But the other ones all have gray sockets. They are based on gray values, and the normal and tangents are based basically on information coming from a vector or a normal node. So that explains a bit these color sockets here, and how we can use this to create a light projection. What we can do now is add some bump to this to make it seem, to make the surface a little bit less flat, let's say. So I'm going to press Shift and A and search for a bump node, B-U-M-P, and drop that in the bottom. I'll take the output from the first color ramp and I'll drop it into the height input of our bump node. And then I'm going to connect the normal output from the bump to the normal input on our shader, and we'll see the effect of that here. So now it looks like we have these indentations and these grooves and this kind of distortion on the surface of the material. and that can be controlled by the strength and the distance options here. So if I bring the strength down, this will start to become flatter and flatter and flatter again. And if I open this back up, push this value up again, we will have some bump visible. This is not moving the surface of our geometry at all. This is just adding in some information that is causing these reflections. If we do actually want to offset this geometry and change the shape of this, we can do, but we need to work with a displacement node for that. So to work with displacement, we're going to use the same input as the bump node, but we need to add in a displacement node. So I'll press Shift and A on the keyboard, search for displacement, find the displacement node, and take this output again from our first color ramp, drop this in to the height of our displacement node, and then connect this displacement up here with our displacement option in the material output. Initially, nothing's going to really change. We need to change this in our material settings on the side as well. So if you come to the side here in the properties, choose your material properties, scroll all the way down, and you'll have a displacement menu here. This is not where the setting lives. It actually lives under settings underneath it. So if you click under settings, scroll down again, look under surface, and then look underneath surface, you will see displacement. So this is a bit hidden, I know, but settings, surface, displacement. This will be set to bump only by default. And if I change this from bump only to displacement and bump, my displacement is now working. However, this is quite chaotic and horrible to look at, and we can easily fix this by just changing the scale to 0.1, for example, and now we have a small amount of offset. If I increase this value, our offset amount increases, but we can improve the look of this by subdividing this mesh more. So if I come over to the right side again, I choose my object to the right side and click on the modify properties, and I just increase the viewport levels to 5, up to 6 even. We're going to have a lot more mesh to displace, and I can push the scale of this down again a little bit more because it's quite chaotic right now. So at this point, what we could do is start to fine tune this a little bit. I might want to actually flip the direction of this emission, because it's now, the emission is coming from the top edges, and it would be good to have the emission coming from inside the sunken bits. So if I just take my blue slider and I flip it to the other side, and then I bring the black down on top, that will mean now that the emission is coming from the cracks in between rather than the edges and the points on top. Right. Let's add in another color ramp. So Shift and A, and I'll search for a ramp here, add one in the top. Bring this output into this input again. So the first color ramp we're using for pretty much everything at this point. Bring it into this color ramp here and put this into our color. This will mean now that we can add in some base colors. So if I change this black one to, let's say, a nice blue color, I change this white one to a light blue color, something like this. Maybe even lighter. And then we're going to add in another color in the middle. So let's say purple. Purple like this. And then if I drag this guy down, we can kind of create some nice purple blending into blue, blending into light blue, just to use as the base color. But this is still looking pretty blocky. So let's look at our input over here. I'm going to set the scale of this to about 4.5, so I'll reduce this a bit. I'm going to turn the detail of this up to maybe 15. And the roughness 0.5, let's try. And the distortion 0.5. Okay. So just by making those changes, this material has now started to kind of look more like a rock than the kind of crazy thing it was before. This is quite easy to control through the detail. So if I bring the detail down, this is going to look a lot kind of liquidier and blobbier. And then if I increase this detail consistently, I'm going to start to get these edges that look a bit uh, hard, like the edges of a rock, for example. We could change some of this rotation maybe, see how that affects things. Could change some of this one as well. And just like positioning these rotations to kind of get a nice look on this to start off with. Take some time, you know, there's a lot of creation you can do here. You could go back into your colors. You could change these around a bit and you start to blend different colors in. I quite liked the purple from before, so I'm just going to leave that. But now this has kind of built up the beginning parts of this material. The last thing that we could add is using this roughness guy right here. I think I'm just going to change these values a little. Let's see. Like that. I'm going to press, actually connect this into my transmission and see how this looks. Actually, let's turn the transmission all the way up and let's disconnect the metallic. The reason I'm doing this is if I turn the metallic all the way down and I turn the transmission all the way up, the material will start to work like glass. So at this point, I've got the emission set quite high. So if I turn this to 0 as well, you'll see what I mean here. So this now has this kind of glassy surface to it with this transmission activated. If I turn this back down, it looks harder and rockier, whereas this is allowing some light to pass through it. The same with the alpha. If I bring the alpha down, I will start to make this transparent and disappear. But this is kind of controlling the glassiness, let's say. But this setting can also be controlled over here on the side. If you go to render properties, scroll down and look at light paths, and then under light paths, look at transmission. If you increase this number of light paths here, you will get a better transmission effect over here. So that's just to explain how we can make this look glassy. But I'm going to go back to my material properties and then reconnect some of these nodes. So let's turn the emission strength back up because we liked the glow that was coming from this. I think I might even add one more node, one more color in here. Change this to more of a blue and just bring this down a bit. Right. I'm going to use the same roughness and roughness output from my transmission as well. So some parts of this feel glassy and some of them don't. And that is about it at this point, I think. We can go back into this and start to, you know, really tweak this with the roughness values here, for example. We could bring this down, make this a bit shinier. We can reconnect our metallic output here to make this feel more metallic again. And then we can go here and look at our scale and other detail settings for this as well. So if I increase the scale, this is going to start to look bumpier. I'm going to start to get a different look to this as well. So yeah, that's kind of really explaining how all these different aspects of this shader work. We've set up quite a simple procedural material here in Cycles. It's using displacement, it's using emission. We've set this all up using black and white values from a noise texture. So I hope it's taught you a lot about working with the texture system in Blender. Let me know if you guys have questions in the comments. And in the next video, I'm going to show you how to make a nice animation with this and how to render that out and work with the animation render system inside Blender. So I'll see you guys in the next video.